Let's get the. Okay, welcome back. We're coming down to the wire here. We only have we're going to talk about organizational culture, and I think next time human resource management, and that'll about wind up most of the material for the semester. I said that your discussion board is due on Wednesday instead of tonight because we just did one. So I wanted to give you a little extra breathing room so you don't get too sick of them. I probably went a little overboard with the discussion boards. I think I'll give a little fewer next time. But basically, we are near the end, and today I am going to discuss the important topic of organizational behavior. It's one of my favorite concepts in management. I first learned about this idea when I was working at Johnson & Johnson after I'd finished my MBA, and there was a book at that time. It's mostly of historical interest now. It was kind of a bestseller at the time, but I don't think it has too much relevance to today's world, but it's worth having heard of. The book is In Search of Excellence by Peters and Waterman. And what they did in that book was they're professors at Stanford, and what they did was they went through a bunch of companies. It's similar to Jim Collins' Good to Great. They identified like companies with long-lasting overperformance, and they tried to identify what the characteristics of these highly performing companies over a long period of time. I forget the precise criteria they used, but they identified a group of high-performing companies. And what they found in that book is that one of the key, if not the key element that they all shared, was that they had a strong corporate culture. Okay, the companies, the book was written about 40 years ago. So plenty has changed since that time. But the concept of organizational culture is still important, but I think becoming somewhat less so because of the changes that technology has caused. And we've talked about this already with organizational structure, that technology has caused a flattening of organizations. It's caused increased outsourcing and new organizational forms that are more loosely linked, such as firms that have a core kind of planning unit that does the marketing and the research and development, and then outsources a lot of the stuff that can be outsourced to the poorer countries, to the third world countries, and that would include stuff like manufacturing. So this kind of more flexible organization is going to have a much looser culture. Of course, within the core unit at the corporate office, so the planning section that does a lot of the conceptual work, there still will be, in fact, that process might even intensify the strength of the organizational culture. In this class, we encountered organizational culture in the case of the Smile Factory, and I think to a lesser degree in the aircraft brake scandal, because I mean they had a culture too. It was a highly politicized negative one. In Enron, there was also a strong culture, but also one of a dysfunctional nature, let's say more of a dark triad kind of nature, Machiavellian, manipulative, psychopathic culture. And you saw that in part when the top executives went on these wild vacations where they would engage in dangerous sports like I think it was motorcycling and rough terrain where they'd break their leg and things like that. This is in the book Snakes and Suits. Babiak and Hare, Robert Hare is one of the leading experts on psychopathy, say that that kind of activity, this high risk taste for high risk pleasures, is often associated with antisocial personality and psychopathy. These are people who have trouble feeling anything and need highly intense. The obsession with strippers, Lou Pye's obsession with strippers was also, I think, related as well. So basically, we've kind of encountered, I think, a few cases of negative corporate culture and a couple of cases of positive ones. Especially, well, I don't know if Disney, that's sort of debatable. But I mean, the Disney culture is positive in the sense that it's economically efficient. And I don't know if it's good for the employees or, the control system is a happy way to do it. But the firm as a whole has tended to be successful until recently. I can look up Disney on the web. What the stock performance has been, and I think it'll probably look pretty good, except for the most recent period where there's been some issues. Yeah, so let me put this on the screen share. Disney's stock overall has been highly performing. Let's see if I can get a bit bigger here. Has been darn, where'd it go? Okay, max. So it really went up. Oh, that's back in the 70s. Wow. Oh, I see. This thing is I'm having trouble navigating this crazy chart. But let's go to more recent times. So you can see here, this is our era. So you can see here it had a great run in the early 2000s. It stagnated for a while. This is usually stocks do things like this. And then it really went up from 21 or so, from 20 to 21. So it had a great run, went up about 80%, and then it went back down. Now it's pretty much, I think, as low or close to as low as it was. It may actually be, it's just about where it was 2 years ago and much lower than where it was back in the early 2000s. So it hasn't done that well in the last 2 years, but you can see like the culture, this long-term performance is strong, and the culture has been a contributing factor. That's my main point, that the culture really matters. And if you want to put this kind of material into context, I think the model that Mike Tushman gives in Winning Through Innovation is a good one. He argues that firms, there are 4 building blocks to management: the task, the technology that the firm uses, the task, and how the work is performed, the structure of the organization that we talked about last time, the culture, corporate culture, and the human resource management, which we will talk about next time. And so these four building blocks, we don't talk about strategy a lot in this class, but strategy is an important, not just a modifying variable, but it's a precondition for the way firms organize themselves. In other words, the environment, if I can extend this a little, move this back, the environment should shape all of these factors, including the structure of the task. In other words, how the environment, including like what kind of product the firm is making. So the task, the structure, the culture, and the HRM should all fit together and be consistent with the nature of the environment. And in turn, I think, especially the nature of the firm, if it's a large firm, will in turn modify the environment. I would say a firm like Disney is not just influenced by the environment facing entertainment firms, but actually is a shaper of the environment. So there's a back and forth between a huge firm like Disney, or even where I work, Johnson & Johnson, which is not quite as influential as Disney, but it's a top 50 firm. And the way that interaction occurs, the firm does things in reaction to the environment, comes up with new ideas, and then changes the environment, innovates and changes the environment. And all these building blocks of the organization need to fit together so that they're functioning in a coordinated way. And then this coordinated interaction, as and the strategy itself is a way to cope with the environment, as well as again shaping when it's a very large firm, not when it's a small firm. If it's a family business or something, it's different, but I'm talking about mega firms like Disney and Johnson & Johnson. And so there's interaction between the strategy and the environment, and then the strategy should lead to these building blocks, which should all fit together. And sometimes these will also have a reverse effect on the strategy. Like if certain things are working well, if certain things evolve in the building blocks, the culture changes, or the HRM has new characteristics, you might change the strategy. And then the outcome is the firm performance. So that's sort of where this model becomes testable. And you could say, well, how well did firms that adapted their technology or failed to adapt their technology do? What was the role of human resource management? How they motivated people, how they selected people? What was the role of culture? What was the role of their structure, whether they were functional or divisional, matrix organization? What kind of span of control? These kinds of questions. And how all of that influence the performance. So all of these things that I've been talking about in the last section of the class, certainly they build on the psychological elements that we were talking about earlier, things like personality and motivation at the micro level, at the motivating the employees level. But they also take on a life of their own and have their own sphere. So in a way, the direction of the class starts out with the individual and looks at personality traits and how groups perform. So you go from personality to teams and groups to the organization, but the organization takes on a life of its own, and it's on a different kind of analytical level that can be viewed as having causes that are independent from the separate individuals. And in many ways, how the separate individuals function and behave is going to be influenced in turn by these more macro, by these bigger variables. So basically today we're going to talk about the culture aspect. And culture, as you probably know, but haven't thought about, is an anthropological term. And people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict back in the 1940s would talk about the culture of tribes, and they would, anthropologists go and study, do field studies with tribes, and look at the archaeology of past cultures. And basically, they're trying to figure out what the different components of the culture are and what the assumptions are. So basically, you can say the same thing about organizational culture, that in a way, it's like a tribe. And one of the points that these guys from Stanford, not just Peters and Waterman, but Mike Tushman's co-author on the book Winning Through Innovation, Charles O'Reilly, did a lot of work in this area. For instance, he lived with cults. The Amana cult was a cult in the Midwest. I think it's in Ohio or something. And they started to make money to support the cult. They started a refrigerator business, and the refrigerator business became very successful, and it became a known brand, Amana, which is sold in stores. I think the cult, I don't know if it still exists or not, but they had founded it and then sold it off. And he lived with them and studied it and so on. And one of the points that Peters and Waterman make in Search of Excellence is that the corporations are a lot like cults. I mean, they didn't come up with that idea. It goes back much further than them. Philip Selznick in the 1950s wrote about corporate culture, and he, if you go back further, you could even say Chester Barnard, who was an executive at AT&T, New Jersey Telephone, argued that the morals of the firm are what drives performance. And, morals is just another term you could use for organizational culture. It's sort of an old-fashioned term. So what is organizational culture? It's a system of shared meaning held by the organization's members. It distinguishes the organization. It's part of the unique set. I mean, I think if you go for a job interview, I once talked to an advertising guy, and he told me that if a job applicant comes in and they say to him, "This is how I perceive the culture of your organization, is that accurate?" That's going to be a good question. So I think when you go in for a job interview, one thing you can ask yourself and try to find out through secondary sources, through the web and books and articles, is to what is the culture of the organization you're interviewing for. If you're going to interview at Microsoft, you should know a little bit about their culture and have a theory about whether you fit or don't fit the culture. Basically, I think a lot of why people leave companies, I know I left J&J because of this, is if they don't really fit the culture. And you have to ask yourself, where do I really want to be? If you look at the culture of J&J, it was founded during the Civil War, a little before the Civil War, and it became a known firm for inventing first aid kits and other stuff like that. But the one who really turned it into a huge conglomerate was the grandson of the founders, who was a general in I think he was a general in World War II. He was a reserve general, but I think he saw action in World War II. But in any case, he organized the company along military lines, and it was a very, very hierarchical, rigid culture that you had to go through chain of command and so on, and everyone was expected to fit in and do what they're told, and very military in its structure, in the way the chain of command was structured. And I didn't really fit in that with that. So I didn't last long. I lasted a couple of years and I left. So I mean, the thing is, every culture is different. And just because a company is well reputed doesn't mean you're going to like the culture. It could be there's a company that has a great prestige and you just don't fit in. It's not your cup of tea. So basically, I think a big question you need to ask yourself before you go on a job interview is this the culture? Does this company have the culture for me? It's a little bit different in entrepreneurial settings, because the personality of the owner is going to have a big effect on the culture. So you can gauge that pretty easily. But in these mega companies, the culture has a life of its own. It probably also, in some cases, has taken on the characteristics it has because of the owner and the immediate reports who structured the company early on. It may not be the exact owner, but it could be people that reported to the owner that built the organization. In the case of J&J, it was the grandson of the founder. And this in the case of Merck Corporation, which is a competitor, they also make pharmaceuticals. It was not the Merck that brought the company to the US from Germany, but it was, I believe, his son or grandson, George Merck, who became famous for shaping the company and bringing in research and development, bringing in the role that Merck was the first major corporation to actually integrate the scientific process. Other companies had research and development, but Merck was famous for bringing in drug research into its corporate structure. And, that modified the culture dramatically. And that came from not the founder, but the son, grandson of the founder. Another example of that is the Washington Post, which was owned I'm trying to remember her name. It just escaped my mind. Catherine Graham. Catherine Graham's father was the publisher of the Washington Post, and he committed suicide. She was married. No. It was her. I think it was her husband. The father died. Her husband was the publisher. Women in that era didn't work as readily, and her husband was the one who committed suicide. And then she inherited it. It was hers in the first place, and she was then saddled with the responsibility of running it. And she became known as one of the best executives of all time. And she largely shaped the newspaper into what it is now. Before Catherine Graham, it was a second-tier minor paper. And one of the things she did was she allowed the Watergate investigation. Basically that put the paper on the map. I'm trying to remember those two reporters' names. I'm not having a good day today. Woodward and Bernstein. And those two guys made the reputation, but she provided them with the resources. And she did other things and elevated the paper to becoming a superstar paper, like about equal in reputation to the Times and the Wall Street Journal. And this was entirely due to her shaping. So it's not always the founder, but it's often the heir, or it could be people who report to the founder who have a big influence. But in any case, the culture comes from these early participants in the company. And basically the idea of the corporate culture, you could call it collective mental programming. One textbook I used to use called it that. You could say it's the system characterized by beliefs, values, and assumptions, which filter what employees perceive, are manifested as symbols, and form the foundation for shared meaning. So in a lot of these companies, they utilize symbolism. You look no further than McDonald's and the arch. And the guy who made McDonald's, and again, it wasn't the founder who really made McDonald's. The McDonald's brothers created the concept. They created the idea of a scientific management of fast food, and the fast food assembly line and all this kind of thing. That was invented by these two brothers in San Bernardino. The one who really built the company and created the culture was Ray Kroc. And basically, he had, his dream was to make the McDonald's arches as prevalent a symbol as the American flag, that you would go into every town in America and you'd see an American flag at the town hall, and you'd see the McDonald's arches in the shopping area. And in a way, he succeeded, but this idea of symbolism plays a very big role in organizational culture. And another example out of Peters and Waterman is one of the firms they talk about, I forget which one, has an award that they give each year called the Golden Banana. And one person, one engineer who does, I think it's Emerson Electric, one engineer who invents the best new idea, who creates the best new product or the best new concept, gets awarded the Golden Banana. And where that comes from was that when the firm was first founded, they were working on a very difficult problem. No one could solve it. And an engineer rushes into the founder's office and says, look, I have the solution. And it worked. And the guy said he had nothing to give him. He had no resources, and he had a banana on his desk. And he said, here, thank you. I thank you. Please take this banana. And so from then on, they awarded the banana. And a lot of the best companies have that kind of symbolism in their culture. So basically, if you look at William Ochi, who taught at UCLA when I was there, I didn't take his class, but a lot of my friends did, and he used to talk about it a lot. He wrote a book, Theory Z, about the huge role that culture plays in the Japanese firms. And he argued that in an article that he wrote, that there are three systems of organization: markets, bureaucracies, and clans. And markets are like you buy and sell. The sociologist Tierney's called this Gesellschaft. And it means like market relations. And each of these, so I'll put up here, each of these forms of exchange, let's call them, is associated with a control system. And this idea of market control, market relations that we all experience every day. We go to the supermarket or we go to the shoe store or the department store or whatever and buy something. We contract with a construction firm to fix our house. All of these things are controlled by contract. That's a very important form of relation. You buy a house, you sign a contract. You hire a lawyer, you get onto a website and they make you sign all that gibberish that you always just check off. And that's a contract. Bureaucracies, it was also created by a German the concept Max Weber. And the idea of bureaucracies is that the control system is by rules and regulations. Okay, I won't use the term norms, which would fit, but norms being standards of behavior, because I think the point that Ochi is making in this model is that the bureaucracies emphasize the rules. They emphasize laws, regulations. So when you go to work at a company and they say, when I first started working, I worked in a place that you had to wear a tie. And I came in one day in a turtleneck. I thought it was cool. And the head said, you have to go home. You're wearing a turtleneck. So, bureaucracies have rules and regulations. And so I actually should have put that under contract because it's also a control system. So trouble with this thing. So the rules replace the contract. And what Ochi's point is that part of the reason bureaucracies are more efficient than markets for organizing corporations is that they cut down on what's called transactions costs. And the economist Ronald Coase first identified this concept in the 1930s. And Oliver Williamson wrote a very important book in organizations called Markets and Hierarchies. Much later than Coase, but he bases it on Coase. And basically the idea is that what drives a lot of the structure and attributes of organizations is the extent to which transactions costs come into play. So the reason that most lawyers settle a case, for example, is that it costs a lot of money to litigate. And the reason that companies divisionalize is it's cheaper to have a president who oversees the entire operation than to try to oversee it centrally. And so all the structures of organizations are driven by the costs of organization, by the transactions costs. And transactions costs would be the cost of drawing up a contract, the cost of setting up an organization, and so on. And one of the reasons that bureaucracies are cheaper is that you don't have to have a lot of contracts. If you have 20,000 employees, you don't need 20,000 contracts. You just have one contract that applies to everybody. And it's kind of like when you get on a website, they don't tailor the contract to everybody, to each person. Instead, everybody just checks off the same contract and never reads it. And so in a way, that's more like a bureaucracy than a true market relation. And so by establishing a bureaucracy, the firms economize. And Ochi's main point then comes to the third one. So everyone knows about bureaucracy from Weber. But what Ochi is saying is that in the 1950s, the Japanese firms and many American firms had pioneered this too. I just mentioned, In Search of Excellence, and that was the point of that book, that many of the American firms of that time had already created these strong cultures. And the idea of a clan is that it's actually more efficient than a bureaucracy. And the reason is that instead of setting up rules that are rigid, they use organizational culture. They use a culture that's far more flexible and allows employees to take responsibility. One of the ideas in management is that you need to empower people. That if a salesperson has the authority to take back, somebody bought something, they don't want it, the salesperson has the authority to exchange it and knows the customer, that this is going to enhance customer relations. But the way that you're able to empower people is if they share the values of the corporation. And that's why culture is so important. That by inculcating the beliefs of the top management, they are able to empower the employees to make decisions. Please excuse me 1 second. I have to go to the bathroom for 1 second. I'll be right back. Apologies for the interruption. So basically, culture functions as a control system that's far more elaborate. And I think you saw that in the Disney article, that a lot of what goes on there is far too complicated to be expressed through a set of rules and regulations. But rather, a lot of what the behavior is driven by the norms of the employee group as influenced and controlled by the management. And so what Disney does by having this kind of culture is make behaviors very predictable. And the reason that firms with strong cultures that are performance related, of course, you could have a strong culture and not have a strong focus on performance. A lot of firms can have dysfunctional cultures. All right, so your book talks about 4 kinds of competing values that characterize culture. The first is the clan, and they're using it in a slightly different meaning from the one I was just talking about with Ochi. where it's focused on trust. Okay. The adhocracy is a culture based on change, where employees value growth, stimulation, autonomy. A market-based culture is one based on achievement, where employees value communication, competence, and competition. And hierarchy cultures are based on stability, where employees value communication, formalization, and routine. I would say at J&J, I would say the hierarchy, to my experience of it anyway, was the hierarchy culture was the dominant one. There was a lot of emphasis put on formalization, at least where I worked. And I once had a friend who whose brother had gone to Harvard Medical School, and he told me he took a job there. I had already been gone from there for many years. It was like 7, 8 years later. And I said to him, "Oh, don't take the job. He's going to hate it. You know, he wants to be a doctor. He's going to, you know," and he left. He took the job and then he left within a year. He just couldn't take the degree of control that they exercise. Very controlled hierarchy. Not everybody likes that. Some people do. I mean, it's a matter of personality, who fits in and who doesn't into a given culture. So basically, there's an instrument, and this gets a little technical. There's an instrument called the Organizational Culture Inventory, which groups culture into constructive values that value affiliation, encouragement, and achievement; passive defensive cultures that are conventional and value affiliation; and aggressive defensive cultures that are competitive and power-oriented. The organizational culture profile has 8 dimensions, which are a little different. And the dimensions are innovation, attention to detail, decisiveness, team orientation, outcome orientation, aggressiveness, supportiveness, and rewards emphasis. To me, these kinds of dimensions aren't that important. I mean, it may be that you can see regularities in performance from dimensions like this, but your experience working in a large firm is driven more by the degree to the style of decision making, how people interact, how supportive the management is. Those kind of things are measured in different ways. The dimensions in the organizational culture profile do focus on performance, and they're probably easier to test. But from an employee standpoint, that's not the kind of thing that really affects whether they're going to like a company or not. The dominant culture of a company is the one that expresses the core values that are shared by most of the organization's members. And their values accepted through the organization. Now, you might say, how could it be that if American companies are often, as Alfred Chandler claims in Strategy and Structure, are often decentralized, how is it that these companies have values that are accepted throughout the organization? And just to review for a second, Lawrence and Lorsch pointed out, as I said last time, that highly differentiated organizations that have separate divisions where the managements are separated a lot, are going to have integrative devices if they are to be effective. And one of the key integrative devices is organizational culture. So what they do is they rotate employees around the company. They have meetings where the executives meet each other. They appoint top managers who know the corporate culture and make sure that the operating unit is consistent with the company culture. Now, of course, there are also subcultures within any department. Even if you have a functional form of organization and you have functional departments, each department is going to have a slightly different culture. The accounting department might look down on the HR department, or the HR department might say that the manufacturing department is annoying, and so on. And so basically, mini cultures within an organization, typically defined by departmentalization or geographical locations, are going to differentiate the company. I used to work for a mining company. International Nickel is a large mining company. It's now owned by Vale Corp, which is a Brazilian company. But Inco had about 30,000, 40,000 employees, a big outfit. And my job was in the New York corporate office. There was also a Toronto corporate office in Canada. But I was told, I never actually made a field trip to the mines, but I was told that if you go up to, say, the mines in Thompson, Manitoba, the city Thompson was actually named after the CEO of Inco going back. And if you went up to the mines there, it was like going to the Wild West. There'd be brawls in the street, and people are drinking and shooting each other and all kinds of stuff like that. And the culture up there was like completely different from the corporate culture, because there was very little connection. The type of people that worked in the mines were young, very tough youngsters who, and there weren't a lot of women there. It was all male, and it had a very strong dynamic. And the corporate culture had little to do with that. So I was told that if you ever go up there, that's how it is. So basically, in strong cultures, organizations' core values are both intensely felt and widely shared. And strong cultures will affect the outcome. So basically, a good top management will be well aware of the organizational culture, especially in a large firm. But if you're in a small firm, let's say with 20 employees, you should already be asking yourself, what kind of culture am I creating? When Mike Bloomberg, I know this story because my sister worked for him a long time ago when it was a small firm. When Mike Bloomberg was first starting his company, there was a competitor named Telerate, which also had a stock ticker service. And my sister worked there as well. And the head of it was taking cocaine in the office. I mean, the head of the company. And Bloomberg went there to meet with him to suggest that they work together. And the guy was stoned on cocaine. He's a very straight-laced guy. He would have zero tolerance for something like that. And he stormed out of there. He couldn't believe it. And, basically Telerate no longer exists now. The guy that owned it, incidentally, funded his wife, who later divorced him, to start a comedy club, which is now defunct, called Caroline's. Maybe you saw that at one point or another. So in any case, employees learn culture through stories, rituals, symbols, and language. And this is why it's hugely important for the executives to set examples. When Sam Walton was alive, and he was already one of the richest people in the world, he had hundreds of stores, he would go to every store and he would talk to the employees, and he would set an example for them, and they could go home and tell their families, I met Sam Walton today. And it was like a huge influence on the way that the employees felt. And so these companies, IBM employees still talk about Watson, the founder, and at the Long Island Parks Commission, they still tell stories about Robert Moses. And at the Nuclear Navy, at the Naval Reactors Unit, they still talk about Admiral Hyman Rickover. And so basically, in all these companies, the founders become a myth to the company, and the values that the founder expressed and contributed are continued through stories, rituals, symbols, and language, and these take on a life of their own. You could say the same thing for the United States. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson wrote that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And this idea of equality gets carried forward to America today. That's far more far more diverse than in that world. But the emphasis on diversity comes out of that value, that fundamental value of equality that the country was founded on. And so basically the culture comes from the founders, and people are trained and socialized and provided models to adopt them. They adopt rituals and beliefs, symbols, and language to express the culture. And basically, positive organizational outcomes are achieved when the culture and leadership styles are complementary and not redundant or not in conflict. So basically, you need, as I said earlier, you need to have a fit. When I teach HR, I talk a lot about how there needs to be a match between HR and the organizational strategy. And the same thing is true for the organizational culture, that you can't have a successful organizational strategy if it doesn't fit the culture. It's a lot easier. It's hard to change the strategy, but it's even harder to change the culture. I don't want to make it sound like it's easy to change an organizational strategy, but the strategy must fit the culture. And so companies become successful because they have cultures that fit their environment. Now, one of the points that Jeff Pfeffer makes in his work, Pfeffer and Solanchik, in a series of articles, that when the environment changes, the distribution of power has to change. We talked about this with power. And so if the company has a culture that's flexible enough to change, it will be adaptable. In the case history of A&P Corp., which was founded in the 1850s in Manhattan and became the largest retailer in America, it was very flexible. When the children of the founders ran it in the 1930s, and the stores shifted from smaller stores where the grocer would get things from behind the counter to supermarkets that we know today, A&P was able to adapt and make that change. And the founders revamped it into the largest supermarket chain in the country. And they were again successful for another 30, 40 years. The guy that took it over after them, I forget his name, he was unable to make the transition from the supermarket to the big box retailer. And when A&P was confronted with Kmart and later Walmart, they were unable to compete, and they are now bankrupt as a result, because the culture wasn't able to adapt, because the leadership and the culture failed to adapt. Some of the functions of organizational culture include this, creating a sense of identity, facilitating commitment, stabilizing the social system. Culture is like a social glue. All big organizations must have some kind of culture, ways that people expect to communicate with each other. If the culture is very strong, it creates employees who can be trusted. And the point that Ochi makes in that schema about control systems is that if you have a bureaucracy and people are governed by rules. They need to be supervised so that they'll do the things that the rules say. People, the bureaucracy doesn't trust people per se to abide by the rules because it doesn't assume that their minds have been messed with. It doesn't assume that their psychology has been affected by the rules. They often are. Even in The Function of the Executive by Chester Barnard, written in the 1930s, I mentioned earlier, Barnard talks about a telephone operator who had been so ingrained in, he doesn't use the word culture, but the values and morals of New Jersey Telephone, that when she joined the company, she wanted to have a seat next to the window so that she could keep an eye on the house, because she lived down the block and she had a sick mother and she was worried about the mother. By the time her mother died, when her mother was nearing death, she couldn't be moved from her chair at the operator's table because she was so committed to AT&T. I mean, it's kind of a disgusting story, but one, he kind of boasts about it, that the culture was so strong that her mind was modified to such a degree that she was affected in this way. And, you know, we all see these kinds of things. Like one example is like the Marines in the military and the special forces, that they have this very strong training and that creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. And there's a high commitment culture. And so people are not willing to, in other words, they're totally committed to the Marines, I mean to say. And they prioritize their commitment to the Marines above most other things. And this is the thing that Chester Barnard talked about back then, and that that Philip Selznick talks about, is that these cultures are extremely dynamic and difficult to change, and they modify people's personalities to a great degree. I mean, one thing you need to think about, if you go into a line of work, you start to adapt to that type of work. You become that thing. There's a line in the classic movie, The Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese, where I forget the actor's name, that one cabbie says to Robert De Niro at the very end, he says to him, you become your job. You become your job. And basically, that's closely related, that this habitual commitment to the culture of the organization changes your personality and you become committed. And you can say it's similar to a cult. Like part of what Charles O'Reilly's point was with Amana is that these highly committed organizations become cult-like, and people become devoted to them to almost an unbelievable degree. So I may have mentioned this already. One time I was going through the files at J&J. I was in HR, so I had access to a lot of confidential records. I forget why I was looking in these back files. I think they were cleaning things out, we were moving or something. And there was this whole file of this executive who had been fired from one of the divisions. And the next day he committed suicide. He was so distraught at losing his job. To me, I mean, being fired from J&J would have been a blessing. You would have gotten some severance and you could look for another job. I wouldn't mind it at all. But he was so committed to the organization that being fired to him was like a death sentence, which is sad, but it tells you how strong these mindsets are. So basically, can organizational culture influence people's ethics? And that's, yes, I already talked about that with Chester Barnard, that the ethical culture is the shared concept of right and wrong behavior that reflects the true values of the organization and shapes the ethical decision-making. And so we saw with Enron that cultures can be highly unethical and can be influenced by psychopaths. On the other hand, companies can adopt highly ethical cultures and be committed to always doing the right thing. and companies vary from, across the spectrum in that way. Cultures can be a liability if their values don't further the organization. I think I said that already. So basically, a culture of consistency won't work in a changing environment. And so if you devise a culture that's very, very strong, you need to have a way to be able to break it when the environment changes. Otherwise, the firm will die. And you see this all the time in business. If you look at the history of the Fortune 500, I'm going to look this number up because I don't have it exact. If you look at the number of companies in the Fortune 500 in 1950 that still exist, since the first edition of the Fortune 500 in 1955, over 2,200 companies have been in the Fortune 500. Of these, only a small number, 49, have been included every year. And I'll add to that, here's another story from the American Enterprise Institute. Only 52 I'm sorry. Yeah, only 12% of the Fortune 500 firms in 1955 still exist today. 61 firms of the original, these include a lot of well-known names: 3M, Abbott Labs, Bristol Myers, Celanese Corp, IBM. You've heard of almost all of them. Textron, United States Steel is still around. It's almost been killed a few times. But that's it, just 61 out of the original. And the reason, a lot of the reason for it is failure to adapt. And companies come and go. This idea, this has a lot to do with the antitrust issue. For many years, people were terrified of these large corporations, going back to the 19th century. And that's why they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Well, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 that set up rules against collusion and said that, in the 1911, the Justice Department sued for the breakup of Standard Oil. And the fear was that it was a monopoly. There was also a case against A&P in the 1940s. And there was also a case against IBM in the 1980s. And in many of these cases, you see how absurd it is. Oil is now being replaced by green energy and is under attack. So this supposed monopoly, it's a long time, but the supposed monopoly would totally be going out the window. And I read in the paper a few years ago that the Rockefeller family, which was the family that owned Standard Oil mostly, sold all their oil holdings a few years ago. So basically, that's one example, but I think even better examples, A&P was sued for antitrust for being a monopoly in the 1940s and now is bankrupt. IBM was sued for being a monopoly in the late 1970s, and by the 1980s was being replaced by the personal computer and Microsoft. So basically, this thing that these big companies are these unending monopolies and control systems is complete fantasy. One more example, in the early 2000s, there was this huge outcry about Walmart, how Walmart was a monopoly and was controlling everybody. And there were people whose towns, it's a complete lie, it's complete nonsense. But I think some newspapers actually made these false statements that there were towns where the only employer was Walmart. So everybody that lived there either worked there and shopped there. And that's complete nonsense. I mean, a moment's reflection tells you that the story is a complete fantasy. But in any case, Walmart now, it's still doing well, but it's under huge threat from, of course, Amazon and other online retailers. And back in the 70s, the shopping malls had begun, like in New Jersey, in the 1960s, and they were expanding very rapidly. And everyone said, "Oh, the malls are destroying the downtown sections." And in those days, downtown Manhattan was not that great. Where I live, I have a little apartment, and we're in a few days a week, and it's a little cubbyhole in. We're right on Bleecker Street, which is right next to the Bowery. In those days, the Bowery was where the homeless lived. I mean, they were called bums, and these buildings were all flop houses where they give for 5 cents. They would spend the night, and sleep off the drink. But now the apartments now go for $3.5 million. So like the change in is so rapid. So like people were all saying, "Oh, the malls are destroying downtown cities, and look at all the poverty." And now the malls are all shut down. I was in a mall in Kingston, New York, the other day, and it's a ghost town. It was like tragic. They're all shut down. The internet is totally replaced. All these big chains are struggling. So the idea that these companies are monopolies, or that these economic patterns are in any way permanent, is always falsified in a capitalist economy, in a free market economy where change is constant. A lot of people don't like change. I mean, there are a lot of people who say, "Oh, things were better." My wife was telling me that, she lived for 35 years in Germany, and 17 of those were in East Germany. And she still talks to a lot of people in Dresden, and they all say to her, "Oh, if the communist days were back, things would be so much better," and so on. People often don't like change. They, are threatened by change, and it's harder to cope with the new thing. But you can't have progress without change. I mean, if you don't like change, you don't like progress. And so, while change is threatening, looking for an economy where there's never any change is going back to the Middle Ages. I mean, that's what a communist socialist economy really is. It's a permanent structure of feudalism where everybody has their place and things don't change. And basically, things don't evolve as a result. So basically, companies, if they're going to survive, have to be good at change. And you can see how difficult it is for companies to change, in that only 12%, the number I just looked up, only 12% of the Fortune 500 65 years ago is still in the Fortune 500. And the rest are all either gone or were bought out by other firms that were more efficient, and so on. All right, so one last point, then I'll take attendance. Managers can create more ethical cultures by adhering to a few principles. There's a visible role model. So you have Walt Disney, you have Ray Kroc, you have a great leader, you have Robert Moses, you have Admiral Rickover in the nuclear navy. You have a visible role model who establishes values. In the case about Disney, they said that the supervisors would often say, Walt is looking from the sky, things like that. So you have a role model. There are clear ethical expectations of the employees. The employees receive ethical training. They get rewarded with ethical acts and are punished for unethical ones. They get protective mechanisms, and the top manager has good values. And if you put all these things, you do have a strong ethical culture. And that's what most companies want. Okay, so I'm going to finish this discussion next time. I got up to the stuff about organic versus mechanistic cultures. So I'm going to take attendance, and then when I finish, you are free to go. I mean, you always free to go, of course, but if you want to talk to me further, I will stay on for a few minutes. Okay, so have a nice day, and I'll see you next time, and we'll continue with culture and get into HR stuff, which is the last topic of the class. So we're getting down to the wire, and your discussion board is due next time. Okay. Syed. Syed Abbas. Syed Ahmad.
Here.
Hello, have a good day.
Me too.
Thank you. Samima Akhtar.
Here.
Hello, Samima, have a good day. Alessandro Leschi.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning, have a good day, Alessandro. David.
Yes, Professor, here.
Have a good day.
You too.
Anna.
I'm here, Professor.
Anna, have a good day.
Thank you.
Melissa.
Good morning.
Good morning, have a good day. Winston.
Hey, Professor.
Hello, Winston, have a good one. Ben.
Here.
Hey, Ben, have a good day. Kai.
Here.
Kai Chan. Is that Kai?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good. Have a good one. This is right. Jirui Deng.
I'm here.
Hey, Jirui. Okay. Farhan.
Here, Professor.
Hey, Farhan. Rihanna.
I'm here.
Rihanna.
I'm here.
Okay, good one. Have a good one. Steve Feng.
Here.
Hey, Steve. Jonathan.
Here.
Hey, Jonathan. June Grant.
Here.
Hey, have a good one. Min Hao.
Here.
Hello. Angelica. Not here. Jian Lin.
Here.
Leon. Leon Lou. Leon. Elizabeth.
Here.
Hey, Elizabeth. Have a good one. Rochelle Mendez.
Here.
Okay, have a good one. Demi Mullings.
Here.
Have a good one, Demi. Cameron.
Oh, hi, I'm here.
Good, Cameron.
Good, Cameron.
Have a good one. Neglia.
Here.
Hello, have a good one, Nicholas.
You too.
Thank you. Aquino. Jenny.
Here.
Okay, hey, Jenny, have a good one. Chenille.
Here.
Okay, Chenille. Anna Siddiqui.
Have a good day, Professor.
You too, Anna. Chenille Pal. Did I get Chenille Pal? Chenille? I think I got Chenille. Jaron.
I'm here, Professor.
Okay, Jaron, thank you. Have a good one. Yuen Wu.
I'm here.
Okay. Kristen. Kristen Yip. And Anita Zhao.
Here.
Hello. All right, let me just call off the ones that didn't answer. Angelica. Leon? Is Leon here? Aquino.
Hi, Professor. I'm here. Sorry, I was trying
Okay,
to
Kristen,
figure
I
out.
got you. Okay, that's it.
Okay.
All right, does
Have a good
anyone
one.
have questions
Bye.
or you're
Oh,
done?
Professor, you didn't call me.
Winjin? I didn't call
Yeah.
you?
No.
Oh, all right, I got you. Don't worry, Winjin. Gotcha, don't worry.
Professor, do you have a minute to talk?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So I was just questioning something real quick. So I missed, I think, one or two discussion boards.
Let me